Hey everyone! In this video I'm going to talk about the great opportunities but also the potential pitfalls of leveraging big data to answer social science questions. So let's start with the basic question, what is big data? There are lots of different definitions and lots of different characterizations of what constitutes big data and what makes data ultimately big. But one kind of common feature of a lot of definitions are these three V's, namely volume, velocity, and variety. So roughly, what characterizes big data is that there's a lot of it, and there's a variety of different formats, and it's being created constantly. For example, when it comes to online trace data. And that also relates to another important feature. It's collected constantly, created and collected constantly by companies and governments. And importantly, the purpose for which these data are collected is other than, it's not research, it's other purposes than research. They can be either profit related for companies, or they can be other purposes for governments to collect information for policy making. But for these purposes as well, or these data as well, are not primarily recorded and gathered and collected for the purpose of answering scientific or social science research questions. So big data are created ultimately either, or many types of big data are usually created either as government administrative records or business administrative data. And so a first step to learning from big data is realizing that ultimately they're kind of part of a broader category of data that has been used by social science researchers for many years, which is observational data. Okay. And what we mean by observational data is ultimately any data that results from observing a social system without directly intervening in it in some way, as for example with actual experiments. Okay. And so given that big data are collected for other purposes than research, if we do want to leverage them to answer substantive social science question, we need to repurpose these data, and that of course comes with certain advantages and certain disadvantages for us as social science researchers. So there are a couple of different pieces of advice when we kind of think about how we can ideally make use of different sources of data that are collected by kind of third-party agencies. The first piece of advice that is important to think about when you kind of find a new data source or try to collect some online digital trace data or some administrative records that you find in archives and things like that, is ultimately kind of start with like a first principled or with the first question of what the ideal data to answer your research question would look like, right? So if you ultimately were in the position to kind of collect the kind of perfect data set to answer your question, how exactly would that data set be structured? How exactly what types of observations, variables, units of analysis would you have in this data set? And then ultimately think about how does the data that you have available compare to this kind of ideal data. Because more often than not, there are important differences between what you want ultimately to answer your question and what you have, what is actually available to you. And noticing these differences will ultimately help you clarify what you actually can and cannot learn from the data that you have. And it might also ultimately suggest to you that you have to collect more data, or you have to rethink how you can answer your research question. The second piece of advice for working with repurposed data is that it's really important to understand the data generating process. And that is because as I mentioned before, usually when we work with big data, these are collected by third-party agencies, government or business that had a different purpose in mind, and if we kind of want to make use of these data, what helps is to kind of reverse engineer what goals these data creators had, what exactly their interests were, why they collected these data, because ultimately that will help us. That will ultimately help us answer or figure out to what extent or how we can use these data in a most efficient, most effective way. And lastly, since the available data that you might find is oftentimes not sufficient or maybe not directly applicable to answer your research question, another important thing to remember is that big data is not all of computational social science, right? So one thing that we emphasized before is that computational social science always involves this combination of ready-mades and custom-mades, right? And we talked about how, for example, administrative records or cell phone records or, other types of big data sources are these repurposed ready-mades, but we can kind of supplement them potentially with, surveys or other kind of custom-made data sources, okay? Another, or based on this discussion of kind of repurposed data or big data being repurposed in general, there are a couple of common characteristics that we can identify that we can identify and that are kind of shared by most big data sources. So as I mentioned, in general, there are kind of advantages and disadvantages that are connected to the fact that big data are collected not for the purpose of academic research. In general, there are a couple of characteristics that are helpful for us as researchers. Among them that these data are big, always on and non-reactive, and I'm going to talk in a second about each individual one in more detail to explain what exactly it means. But there are a lot of disadvantages and a lot of problems that are related to these characteristics of big data as kind of repurposed data that are collected not with research in mind. They're usually incomplete, they're often inaccessible, they're non-representative, they can be drifting, they can be algorithmically confounded, and dirty and sensitive. There are, while there are a lot of advantages and a lot of great potential, there are also a lot of issues. But if you look at those two lists of kind of advantages and disadvantages or pros and cons, the point here is not that kind of the disadvantages outweigh the costs outweigh the benefits or anything like that. But the way we kind of want to think about this is we want to leverage the helpful aspects as much as possible, but always keep in mind the potential drawbacks and kind of think about potential solutions to minimize any problematic side effects. So let's focus on each of these individual points individually, just really briefly. The first helpful aspect of big data, of course, is that it's big, which can have a couple of really important advantages for social science researchers, because it ultimately allows us to study things that otherwise we might not be able to study. For example, very rare events. Or when we're interested in estimating heterogeneity, So, differences between certain groups in the population, or differences in, effects over time and things like that, then it can be really important to have a large amount of data available. Similarly, if we're interested in the detection of small differences as part of our research, then we need large amounts of data, and so big data sources, of course, help in that goal. One thing that is often kind of forgotten as data sources become larger and larger and include more and more information, even if we have a large, impressively large data set that allows us to very precisely estimate certain treatment effects, for example, what is often forgotten is that large data sources actually make it even more necessary to worry about systematic errors due to how the data was created. So if there are certain biases, either when it comes to selection, who you're going to study, or regarding the underlying mechanisms, it is really important to kind of take into account whether there are systematic deviations between ultimately the data that you're trying to study, and on the other hand, the population that you're trying to make kind of extrapolate to. The second advantageous aspect of big data is that it's always on. So that means that these data are collected continuously. They're not, they're not collected, for a specific study in a specific survey, but they're, continuously producing real-time data points. And this can be really useful, for example, when we want to study unexpected events. For example, the recent COVID crisis and the pandemic is certainly an unexpected event. And if we have some source like social media data that allows us even retrospectively to study the effects of these unexpected events in a way that otherwise we wouldn't be able to study, just because we can't plan a survey in advance to study this unexpected event. But again, this also comes with disadvantages, because there are kind of drawbacks associated with that as well, because on the one hand, while we're able to kind of produce these real-time estimates and look at changes over short periods of time, that doesn't necessarily mean that always-on data sources are well suited for tracking changes over very long periods of time. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of drifting and other kind of sources of bias that make it harder to use big data sources to study like long-term trends in, for example, social behavior and things like that. The last big advantage of big data sources is that they're non-reactive. And what we mean by that is that a lot of studies in the social sciences, for example, when they're based on surveys or, for example, lab experiment, they usually involve studying people who are aware that they're being studied. And for certain types of behavior, that might be problematic, because there might be social desirability bias and people being kind of behaving differently because they know that they're part of a study, for example. So since on social, for example, when we look at social media data, people, they might be aware that they're being studied, but they're not necessarily, all the time kind of thinking about, being studied, for example, when they're, clicking on links on Facebook or things like that. So ultimately, these big data sources enable the study of behavior that in some cases couldn't really be accurately measured before because of these social desirability concerns. One of the examples that is mentioned in the book is, for example, the study that used search behavior to look at racial biases by looking at people who are kind of Googling terms are not necessarily thinking about social desirability when they type in search terms into Google. So focusing on the extent to which people search for potentially racist terms and things like that can allow you to measure something that otherwise is really hard to capture using, for example, standard surveys. But of course, we have to keep in mind that these big data sources are not, even if they're non-reactive, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no social desirability bias whatsoever. It certainly depends on the context as well. So now let's turn to kind of the problematic aspects of big data sources for research. The first issue is that big data sources are usually incomplete. So while there's some data available that is interesting, that we can leverage, that is useful, a lot of necessary information may not be available. So one main example here is that oftentimes, ultimately, what we're interested in is not not the specific variables that might be included in a specific data set, but ultimately we're interested in some larger theoretical constructs, and it might not be straightforward to I don't know, for example, if we wanted to study pro-social behavior or things like that, we have to kind of find features in our data sources that allow us to operationalize these theoretical constructs, and that can always obviously be challenging, and sometimes the data that we need might simply just not be available. So in these cases, there are a couple of kind of strategies to address these issues. Of course, we can try to collect additional data, or we can try to kind of impute, if we have observations for some parts of our data, we can try to make inferences about additional observations using imputation, or we can use what is called record linkage, which means we're combining data from multiple sources or from multiple data sets to kind of fill in what is missing in one of our sources. The second aspect is that big data is often inaccessible, so there are often legal, business, and ethical barriers that ultimately prevent data access, and solutions are kind of, it's hard to kind of find general solutions for these issues, but ultimately it kind of depends on building partnerships with corporations that kind of ensure privacy protection and allow it for, on the one hand, provide incentives for example, businesses to share their data, but at the same time give them assurances that from an ethical perspective, make sure that ultimately privacy is protected, for example. An additional factor is that big data sources are non-representative, so the data that we collect, for example, on social media, on Twitter, and things like that, do not necessarily represent a well-defined population. It's not quite clear what population we can generalize to. But in many cases, for many research questions, this is not necessarily such a big deal, because ultimately what we're often focused on in our research projects is to make within sample comparisons between, for example, a treatment and control group, rather than making out-of-sample generalizations. Right, so one important difference, for example, when we think about lab experiments, is that we don't necessarily need a representative sample in our experiment, because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn something about an underlying causal mechanism, and the extent to which what we find about this causal mechanism tells us something about the remaining population is ultimately a question that is not necessarily a statistical issue, but it's ultimately a theoretical issue to what extent these mechanisms are transportable from the sample that we studied to kind of a broader population. Another issue that I briefly mentioned previously is drifting, which means, so there are 3 different types of drifting. The first one is population drift, which means in the context of, for example, specifically social media platforms, population drift describes change over time of who is using a platform. And of course, if we're looking at, or if we're trying to characterize changes over time, based on, for example, Twitter data or based on, other social media platforms, and ultimately the user base changes slowly over time, then this can ultimately jeopardize our inferences. Behavioral drift describes if people change how they use a certain platform. And there are examples of this on Twitter, for example, where people changed how they used certain hashtags in the context of protests. And if they do that, and we're using the hashtags to kind of estimate protest behavior or engagement with the protest, then obviously that can bias our estimates as well. And lastly, system drift describes the change in the system itself, right? So their platforms change their algorithms, they change how specific recommendation systems on YouTube and things like that. And so that also jeopardizes our the inferences that we can make regarding change over time. The next aspect is that big data sources can be algorithmically confounded, and this is related to this systemic drift, of course, which describes that digital systems that record behavior are highly engineered to induce specific behavior. So, for example, clicking on an ad or scrolling in your Facebook feed. And so, depending on how recommendation systems, for example, or if you think about Google searches, recommending additional search terms and things like that, to what extent these systems exist or change over time can, of course, jeopardize our inferences that we can make based on observing certain, for example, search terms and things like that. And that's why it's so important to focus on, to understand the underlying data generating process, and especially if we're looking at changes over long periods of time, to make sure that these algorithmic confounders don't jeopardize our inferences that we're trying to make. Second to last aspect is that big data can often be very dirty, in the sense that they include a lot of data that does not really reflect real actions of interest that help us answer our substantive questions. And so, kind of one way to think about this is this kind of data to information ratio. So there's a lot of data available, but not all of these data, not all of these data are ultimately useful or ultimately helpful. And the important the important thing to do is kind of to identify and isolate the information that is actually useful out of the large amount of available data that we have. Lastly, and this is a really, really important point that we'll come back to when we talk about ethics, is that these data are often very sensitive. So information like search terms or preferences on Netflix is one example that was discussed in the chapters. These can be information that, if they become public, could lead to emotional or economic harm among users, especially when we can kind of link specific user behavior to actual people. And so one of the big challenges with big data approaches and using big data is to make sure that that they're ultimately or that privacy is ensured, and that we cannot make these linkages to actual identifying information. And this is not a trivial task, because the more data is available, even if it's it's not about including the name and the address, but even if you just have a certain number of different data points on the same user, it's surprisingly quick that you can actually identify who the respective person might be, if you have, for example, like digital trace data or search patterns or Netflix user or account information. There have been cases in the past where people were able to identify the underlying users. So this is not a trivial problem, and this is an active area of research to ensure that these big data sources are ultimately ensure privacy. All right, that's all for now about big data. In the next video, I'm going to talk about research strategies.